Good morning and welcome to this, the second meeting of 2014 of the European and External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that mobile phones are switched off, please, and any other electronic equipment that makes a noise? I'm aware that some members are using Kindles and iPads for their papers. That's fine. Can I welcome back to the table Dr Daniel Keneally, who is advisor to the committee on the current inquiry. Can I convey apologies from Patricia Ferguson and welcome Neil Bibby to committee. And could I ask, Neil, if you have any interest to declare?
No interest to declare.
Thank you very much, Neil. Can we welcome back Jamie McGregor, who has been away for a while, but it's good to see you back and healthy, Jamie. Welcome back. The agenda item 1 of our business today is a decision on taking in private agenda item 5. Yes, agenda item 5. Agreed. And it's a discussion on the paper. Agreed? Excellent. Thank you very much. Making swift progress to agenda item 2 is our inquiry. So today we have inquiry into the Scottish Government's proposals for an independent Scotland and its membership of the European Union. And we have one panel today, and we're very delighted to have the panel along today. With us today we have Professor Kenneth Armstrong. We have Professor Sir David Edward, and we have Patrick Layden QC and Aidan O'Neill QC. Can I thank you all, gentlemen, for coming along to committee today? It's a very hot topic, Scotland's place in Europe, and we're looking very much forward to the evidence that you'll provide today. We're going to go straight to questions. On a Thursday morning, we have a very tight timescale for committees, so I'm a bit of a tyrant when it comes to timing. So we're going to go straight to questions, and I think I'm maybe going to open with a question, and it was really around about, the Scottish Government's proposal is to look at Article 48 as a way forward, but there's obviously a lot of debate around about whether that's an appropriate or reasonable method. We heard some very interesting evidence last week from the academics and their understanding of it. But I think maybe I wanted to open with a question on your thoughts on the benefits to Scotland of being a member of the EU and the spirit of the treaties and what the treaties actually mean. And I know that in your evidence, Sir David, you referred very much to the spirit of the treaties, especially Article 2 and 4. And maybe just as an opener, give each of you some time to give me your opinion on that question. And just jump in. Kenneth Armstrong, yeah. You're smiling.
I'm smiling. I mean, it's up to the electorate in Scotland to decide whether they believe that there are benefits of EU membership. I'm generally in favour of the EU and can see that there are benefits for any European state seeking to be a member of the European Union. I think it has enormous potential economic benefits, trade benefits, and plays an important role in democratisation within Europe generally, as we see with the issues in Ukraine at the moment. I know that's different from the Scottish situation, but in general, I can't. There are good reasons for being in favour of Scottish of membership of the European Union, but it really is up to the electorate to make that decision. And as I say, my evidence is. It would have been useful, I think, if that question itself had been put in a referendum to actually determine that.
Patrick Layden.
I agree with that. I'm thoroughly persuaded that the European Union is a good thing from the point of view of the countries of Europe. At the most basic level, it prevented France and Germany from having a war for the last 60 or 70 years. And it's got immense benefits in terms of trade and free movement. But if Scotland is to become independent, then, like Professor Armstrong, I agree that it would be quite nice if people had a chance to decide whether they want to be in. The Norwegians have had two referenda on the question and have decided on both occasions not to join. So it's obvious for a small country on the periphery of Europe to decide that its best interests lie connected to, but not actually in, the EU. That isn't a decision which it looks as if we're going to be able to take.
Okay, thank you very much. So, David.
Well, my position about the EU generally is that the argument about prevention of European wars was a very fundamental and sound argument at the beginning. We're now some years on, but there was another consideration at the beginning, which was stability. The great problem about Europe after the dissolution of the empires in the First War was the instability of Europe, and what was then the EEC was an essential element in creating a zone of stability. And if you look at the potential instability that would have followed the fall of the Soviet Empire, and if you look at the potential instability which exists in the Caucasus, the idea of having a political and financial and social entity which provides a zone of stability is, in my view, fundamental, of fundamental importance. Scotland, with a bit of hesitation at the very beginning, I was involved from the very beginning of our entry, but certainly there were people in Scotland who did not want to be in what was then the European Community. I've always been in favour of Scotland being a member of a constituent part of the European Union, and I think we have played a part in it as well.
Well, there certainly are benefits for any smaller nation to be part of a much larger group such as the European Union. There are benefits, as has been said, in terms of trade, political influence and the like, but there are also benefits to the individual citizens of of any member state, because they become European citizens and therefore have access to a whole range of rights in terms of being able to live and work and move and obtain benefits in other member states and vote as well. So it opens up a much broader world than simply being confined to the borders of one's own particular state. But there has to be, it's not all rosy, of course, because part of becoming a member of the European Union is also necessarily involves a limitation of the rights of that independent state. They're no longer entirely free to carry out policies that they might otherwise wish, or indeed have a democratic mandate from their own electorate to do so. There is, it has to be said, an element of democratic deficit within the European Union. For example, joining the European, if Scotland were to become independent, to become a member state of the European Union, then fisheries is a matter which will remain primarily determined by at a European level with all the other member states. One can say, well, that's currently happens already. But of course, the votes which an independent Scotland as a member state would have in terms of any negotiations would be much less than it does as a part of the United Kingdom. So there are most definitely benefits of being part of the European Union, but there are also responsibilities that go with that and limitations on the power of any state which is a member.
Okay, thanks very much. As an opener, that's pretty good. We've sort of got to an agreement the EU is a good thing, you know, in relative terms. Yeah, the EU is a good thing for Scotland. But I wanted to pick up particularly in so David's evidence where, you know, we're talking about Europe being a good thing and the good faith that carries with it. And you had mentioned in your written evidence to our committee that Articles 2 and 4 and the spirit of the treaties and the good faith that would be taken forward in that. Something like a Vienna Convention, I think that is my thinking. I think you mentioned that very specifically. And one of the concerns that we had last week raised from the academics who came last week was, would there be a situation where Scotland would be out of Europe negotiating its way back in, or would there be some interim arrangement put in place to allow that to continue? And I know that in Article 50 there is a precondition of pre-negotiation before exit, but I mean, I think I'm looking to see if the panel would agree or give me their thoughts on whether there should be a pre-negotiation period should Scotland, because it is unprecedented, there's not any other examples that we can use across Europe, that a pre-negotiation would be the best and an interim arrangement would be the best arrangement for both Scotland and the UK?
Well, if you'd like me to start, I start from a different position from most of the people who've discussed this, because most of the discussion is in terms of the rights of states and whether there will be a continuator state or a successor state or a separate state or a new state. I start from the position, and it's clear in the major judgment of the European Court way back in 1963, that the treaties create rights for individuals, which, as the court put, which is intended to confer on them rights which become part of their legal heritage. And all this discussion about the rights of states, in my view, entirely ignores the fact that people here and people dealing with us have what are called acquired rights. And my view is that the institutions of the EU and the member states, including the United Kingdom, have an obligation, if there is a vote for independence, to ensure that those acquired rights are not abridged or terminated. And that imposes an obligation to negotiate before there is any question of separation, before you get to the stage at which there is a new state. Now, the treaties provide no machinery for this. They provide no machinery for the situation envisaged. They provide no machinery either for what you were speaking of as an interim arrangement. So as far as the treaties go, there is no solution to this problem. But I go back to what was said to me by a very, very experienced Dutch foreign servant who was the Dutch permanent representative and later the Dutch foreign minister. And I asked him about the problem with the euro, and he said, "We will find a way, we always do." And in my view, the reality is that if there is a vote for independence and there is a problem, then it will be for the member states and the institutions to sit down and find a way through it so that you do not have the termination or abridgment of acquired rights of individuals. And that's the fact that the treaties create rights for individuals is what differentiates the European Union from other treaty organizations. And therefore, talking in terms of the conventional rules of public international law which govern relations between states is beside the point, because the European Union is different in this very important respect.
To the panel, if we let the panel finish first, Jamie, and I'll let you in. Kenneth Armstrong.
And I think whatever the merits of understanding the European Union as a legal entity that confers rights on individuals, it is an international organisation composed of member states, and the identity and legal status of being a member state nonetheless remains fundamental. And that is therefore important in terms of the particular legal route down which an independent Scotland might seek to exercise the rights and obligations of EU membership. Clearly, if Scotland becomes independent, it would then seek to become a member state. The normal process for that is the Article 49 accession process. If it doesn't want to go down that route, but wants to go down the route of a treaty revision process through Article 48, that is a treaty revision by member states. And that means that an independent Scotland would be reliant upon either an existing EU member state or one of the institutions to pilot the process by which it would acquire membership. So while I have a certain sympathy with Sir David's position on the status of the individual, nonetheless, the legal status of member state is still crucial to understanding the process by which an independent Scotland might become a member state of the European Union.
Aidan O'Neill.
In a sense, I agree with elements of what both previous speakers have said. The EU is both an international organisation, a treaty among member states, but it's also a supranational organisation in the sense that the treaties do, as Sir David has said, create rights for individuals. In a sense, at some levels, there's always that constant tension within the European Union about it being a relationship between states, but also a relationship of the individual to this body of law which is greater than the states. So those tensions are going to, depending on which you highlight, are going to come up with perhaps slightly different answers. I certainly do agree that it's with Sir David, that it's to misunderstand the EU to talk simply in classic public international law terms about the succession of member states or secession from states, given that the European Union has created a new kind of international legal order, which is unlike any other kind of treaty organisation. One of the issues which has to be borne in mind, as I've said before, is citizenship. Because of our being citizens of a member state at the moment, people in Scotland who are British citizens are European citizens. And that is the status which they have and have certain rights following from that. If, on the classic public international law analysis, Scotland as an independent entity were to leave the European Union, the citizenship of everyone in Scotland, qua European citizen, would remain unless and until their nationality, their former British nationality, were withdrawn from them. And then they might then be said to lose their European citizenship rights. But what you then have is an unstable situation, potentially, of a territory, a new independent state, which is outside the European Union and has none of the responsibilities of the European Union, but all the people within it, as being citizens and having all the rights which would be implicit in the European Union, which is why I would agree with Sir David that there's not just an obligation of good faith, but common sense to actually try and resolve that instability of having 5 million people who are citizens, but whose state has no status within the Union. So something will be worked out. It always is.
Thank you very much. Patrick Layden.
Yes, Scotland's people are citizens of the European Union. They are citizens of the European Union because they are nationals of the United Kingdom. If they stop being nationals of the United Kingdom, they stop being citizens of the European Union. And that isn't going to come along by some constitutional accident. It will come along, as I said in my paper, as the result of a considered, deliberate, informed, I hope informed, decision of the Scottish people. If we decide seriously to leave the United Kingdom, one of the consequences, which is reasonably clear and generally agreed, is that Scotland will not be part of the European Union. We can choose not to do that, or we can choose to do it. What we can't do is say we're going to leave the United Kingdom and be outside the European Union and then get back in, but we will retain all the same rights all the way through. You've got to consider the consequences of your actions before you take them. One of the consequences is that we will stop being citizens of the United Kingdom and as a result, stop being nationals of the United Kingdom and as a result, stop being citizens of the European Union. That will be our decision. And I don't see, and I suspect that certainly the European institutions and other member states will not see that it is their duty to enable us in some way to smooth over that difficulty and carry on regardless. I take entirely the idea that member states of the European Union are bound by a duty of cooperation to make the treaties work, and that's absolutely true. That's what they did when German unification happened. It's what they did over Greenland. They all got together and they said, we can fix this. And that's absolutely true. But we will not be in that happy group because we will have decided to come out of it. And we will then have to come back in. And there is no procedure, as Sir David says, for a state seceding from or departing from or separating itself from a member state. There is, however, a procedure for people who are outside the European Union to apply to join it. And as I've said in my paper, and as Professor Armstrong says in his, that is the procedure which other member states would be entitled to ask us to follow. And they're entitled to say, in terms of the rules of the EU, if you're outside, this is the way you get in. There's no particular magic about that. If we don't want to go down that road, then the solution is not to move ourselves out of the club by stopping being part of the United Kingdom.
So, David, I could see that you were disagreeing there. Did you want to come back in on that?
The simple point is there is a gap between the vote and the moment of separation. And my point is that during that period, there is an obligation to negotiate a solution which does not lead to the absurd result which is being suggested. Now, let's just take an example. At the moment, I am waiting for a delivery of a new car from Birmingham. So it has been delayed. Let us suppose that on this theory, the moment of independence occurs between the time that I have ordered the car and the time when the car is delivered. Do I have to pay customs duty on that car when it arrives? Because Scotland, on this theory, will be outside the customs union. There are a huge number of problems, let alone individual citizenship. And my view is that assuming there is a vote for independence, then the obligation will start with the United Kingdom, which is still, as I've pointed out, the government of the whole of these islands, including Scotland, to propose a solution which will avoid these results. All the discussion, with respect by Kenneth Armstrong and Patrick Layden, assumes that nothing happens until the moment of independence.
Actually, I don't say that. I'm very clear that in my paper that, in fact, I do think that whichever route is chosen, that negotiations can begin. I'm in complete agreement with Sir David that there are good faith obligations, but you still have to decide which route legally you're going down. It's one thing to say you're going to talk about negotiations, but to what end and by what legal means. So I think we can all accept that negotiation will, in some sense, occur, although actually some people might take the view that negotiations should be held up until the moment of independence. It's not an implausible view in some other European capitals. But as I say, we need to be clear about to what legal end that negotiation will actually take place.
Sorry, I don't agree on that. I don't see that on present indications there is a requirement on the United Kingdom to try and propose a solution under Article 48 or any other treaty article in between a vote and independence, because with effect from the day of the vote, the United Kingdom is obliged to consider the interests of its own citizens. And when I say its own citizens, I mean its citizens apart from an independent Scotland. It can't be doing two things. It can't be saying we're acting in the interests of a United Kingdom, including Scotland, and also acting in the interests of soon-to-be independent Scotland and in the interests of what will be left of the UK following formal independence. That's three hats, and you can't ask a single government to wear three hats in that way. So I don't see it at all implausible for the UK to say, post-vote, post-yes vote, we are going to let the ordinary course of European law take its course as and when Scotland becomes independent. It will be in a position to apply to join the European Union. Nor would I think, if I were advising the UK government, that that was an unreasonable position for it to take. And since it's also the position taken by other member state governments and by the institutions, then I see it as seriously impractical to think that we can start a negotiation with Europe prior to formal independence.
If I may, sorry, just I think I would disagree with Patrick Layden's approach, again, because he makes an assumption that there is an automaticity with the independence, a vote for independence, and a loss of British citizenship. Now, a loss of British citizenship may or may not occur, but that will be an active decision by the rest of the UK at such time when there is a rest of the UK entity as an independent entity. Any such decision, because it will have implications for the European citizenship of those remaining British citizens who are now in Scotland, would itself fall within the ambit of EU law and potentially be an issue which could be justiciable before the Court of Justice of the European Union. So this idea that because one becomes, there is independence and therefore there's an immediate loss of British citizenship there's a gap there. There has to be an active decision about that. And prior to independence, the UK government remains, as Sir David has said, the representative of everyone, all British citizens who helped vote for it within the UK, and they have certain responsibilities. Just because there's a vote for independence doesn't make the UK government, therefore, immediately the government for and only for the rest of the UK, and the government for and only for British citizens who live within the rest of the UK. So they still have continuing obligations, it seems to me, as a moral, political and constitutional basis.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to go. I think Jamie has been anxious to get in for a wee while, and I'm going to go to open questions, so just catch my eye.
Well, thanks very much. Well, as long ago as 2004, the then President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, stated almost exactly the same argument as his successor, Jose Manuel Barroso, that upon independence, Scotland would cease to be part of the EU, and that was echoed again by Herman van Rompuy. And I suppose, you know, there's been 10 years, and that was 2004, for this argument to be sorted out, if there's an argument against it. So, and today is meant to be about legal beliefs rather than it'll be all right on the night. So my question is which article holds precedence in European law, 48 or 49? And if it's the case that 48 is actually used, is there a danger that Article 48 would allow other EU countries to make demands on issues such as fisheries in UK waters to ensure they get better deals for their own sovereign states? That's my first question.
As I say in my written evidence, I take the view that Article 49 is what they would call the lex specialis, the specific legal basis for dealing with an entity acquiring the status of being a member state of the European Union. That seems to me the most obvious reading of the treaties. The Article 48 route is, to me, legally implausible, as it is a way of renegotiating the treaties between existing member states and not as a way of dealing with the relationship between existing member states and some other non-member state. There are other provisions of the treaties, the accession process, 49, the international agreement, legal basis in Article 218, that deal with the relationship between existing member states and non-member states. So for that reason, I don't think that the Article 48 route is legally plausible, but more importantly, it's incredibly politically risky. Even if you're in favour of Scottish membership, and even if you're in favour of the idea of a treaty amendment through Article 48, it just heightens the political risks and obstacles to achievement of independence within the EU, within the timetable set out within the white paper itself.
I actually agree with Kenneth Armstrong on this. I think that the arguments that it be Article 48 are not particularly plausible. That's to do with the revision of the treaties, either increasing or decreasing the competence of the Union or the member states. It's a matter among member states. Article 49 seems to be the more obvious option. I think Kenneth Armstrong's paper looks through the possibility of having interim agreements and ways of ensuring that there is not the instability which I mentioned beforehand. But what must not be assumed, as I think is assumed in the white paper, Scotland's future, is that Scotland will simply be able to take over all the opt-outs and the sort of semi-detached status which the United Kingdom has managed to carve out for itself thus far. For example, in terms of Schengen and the Euro and the like, these things will all be a matter for specific negotiation for and by Scotland, and that there isn't any principle, it seems to be, as a matter of EU law, that Scotland there is some notion of the continuity and that Scotland should get all the benefits and the semi-detached status which the United Kingdom has. It will have to argue and negotiate in its own right for its own opt-outs or applications.
Jimmy?
Just coming back to that then, well, during the period, I mean, if we're saying that Independence Day is going to be on the 24th of March, whatever it is, 2 years later, if that is the case, and they actually get to that by then, during that period, is the continuity of rebate, Schengen and currency assured?
During the period that Scotland's still a member of, still part of the United Kingdom, then that's got to be assured. The issue only arises when and if it is seen as a serious candidate for independent membership of the European Union.
Following the Independence Day, it wouldn't be assured.
Nothing is
None
assured.
of that EU citizenship would be assured.
No, EU citizenship is a different matter. That's a matter of the relationship between the individual and the European legal order. But we were talking about in terms of the relationship between a member state and the other member states as a matter of the treaty negotiations.
What I was talking about was the things you talked about, like Schengen and the currency, and also, for that matter, the rebate.
Those are issues which would have to be the subject of negotiation. I say that one cannot assume that any independent Scotland will inherit all the benefits of the negotiations which have previously been carried out on behalf of the UK as a whole.
Okay. Thank you.
David?
Just to be clear about 48 and 49. 48 is not limited to proposals to increase or reduce the competences. It says, the government of any member state, the European Parliament or the Commission may submit to the Council proposals for the amendment of the treaties. These proposals may, inter alia, amongst other things, serve either to increase or reduce the competences conferred on the Union in the treaties. If I can just give one example of what I envisage, there is a vote for independence, then my personal opinion is that it would be the obligation of the United Kingdom to table a proposal for the amendment of the treaties to take account of the situation that will occur at the time when Scotland becomes independent from the rest of the UK.
I also think that Article 49 is the appropriate route. I agree with Aidan O'Neill that we cannot assume that we will be able to take advantage of all the opt-outs. The difficulty I see, leaving aside the technical arguments, the difficulty I see about the United Kingdom presenting a proposal for the amendment of the treaties immediately after a vote for independence is that the negotiating position of an independent Scotland will depend to a large extent on the arrangements agreed between the Scottish Government and the UK Government on matters like whether or not there is going to be a continuing Bank of England as our central bank and lender of last resort. That is an extraordinarily important matter from the point of view of the financial negotiations with the European Union, because I can just about see that it may be arguable if the Bank of England continues as the Bank of Scotland and is our lender of last resort, and if the European Union is prepared to put up with that arrangement, and that is to say, without an independent financial central bank in Scotland, if they're prepared to agree to that, and that's not at all clear, then we could argue coherently that we should stay out of the euro. If we haven't agreed that with the United Kingdom, however, then what are we going to say? What is the United Kingdom government going to say to the European Union by way of treaty amendment? They can't say, we want Scotland to be exempt from Article 119, because at that stage we won't know whether there is a coherent plan to replace Article 119. Article 119 is the one that says that everyone's got to be part of the euro. The UK has a formal opt-out at the moment, but we would have to argue for that. And so it's impossible to work out what amendments to the treaty you would want as at September 2014. You wouldn't know that until you'd finished the process of agreeing with the UK precisely what the split was going to be, what the arrangements were going to be for separating institutions or sharing them. You simply would not know what package Scotland was going to put to the European Union. And so even if the UK wanted to do so, it would not be able to put a coherent proposal to other member states.
Yes, I take your point you're making. So does that mean then that if Article 48 was used, it would still require the UK to do all the negotiations on behalf of Scotland?
Yes, on behalf of the United Kingdom.
On behalf of the United Kingdom for part of their United
including
Kingdom.
Scotland. It doesn't. This argument about the UK ceases to have responsibility for Scotland's position. Does the Parliament of the UK cease to have legislative competence? Do the ministries of non-devolved matters cease to have responsibility during this period? No, they don't. The United Kingdom, until the moment of independence, remains the United Kingdom, and the institutions of the United Kingdom have responsibility vis-à-vis the whole United Kingdom, including Scotland. The idea that there is the vote for independence brings into birth an autonomous entity called Scotland is legally unsound.
There's something incredibly curious, though, about that result. And the White Paper dismisses and derides the current arrangements by which the UK government handles European business that affects Scotland. And yet suddenly, when it comes to the most important issue, that is Scotland's independent membership of the EU, it seems content with the idea that the UK government's arrangements will be okay in handling that. That seems rather odd. And secondly, why would an independent Scotland want to harness its ambitions to a treaty revision process that will be handed by a UK government when we know already that the very strong elements within the ruling party and the Conservative Party would want to reopen treaty negotiations on a whole host of other things, which would likely then bog down the entire negotiation process and may ultimately lead to its failure, which is why I said earlier, it's not so much just that there are legal problems with the choice of Article 48 or 49. Even if you're in favour of 48 as the route, the political risks are so much higher.
But what we're trying to deal with here today is the legal side of things.
But what I say is the political risks follow directly from the legal strategy which is taken. And in response to your question about the UK government piloting the treaty amendment, the point that I was making is that that exposes Scotland to even greater political risks than were it to go down the accession route of 49. So it's the linkage between the legal strategy and the political risks.
Thank you.
Do you, Mr Armstrong, actually believe that a negotiated position between the Scottish Government and the UK Government with a proposal to Europe would not be done in good faith? Are you actually saying that the UK Government would organise a bad deal for Scotland out of spite or something? Is that what you're saying?
I said nothing of the sort. What I said was that if you are, I think the UK government can, of course, negotiate in good faith, but the UK government is going to have to deal with competing interests, one of which are its own interests, which are to open up the treaty revision process to deal with what has been an ongoing debate in the rest of the UK about the division of competences, the repatriation of competences in some areas. All of that agenda will suddenly open up. there'll be an incredible risk of an issue linkage between the issue of Scottish membership of the EU and the UK's own political interests in the EU. And that's not an issue of bad faith. That's just a potential conflict between legitimate interests.
The biggest risk here is actually the UK government's position on whether they want to be in or out of Europe and whether they want to renegotiate treaties?
No. That's really a question which will no doubt be settled at some stage after the next UK election. Sir David Edward is absolutely correct. Until the day of independence, the United Kingdom government has a duty to represent the interests of the whole of the United Kingdom, including Scotland. The difficulty in the period between a vote and formal independence is that the White Paper contemplates that the United Kingdom government will effectively go to Europe and say, we wish to propose treaty alterations which will have an effect after formal Scottish independence. In other words, we want to set up the terms on which an independent Scotland will be part of the European Union. But once Scotland is formally independent, the rest of the UK will be another foreign European country. And it is not at all clear that the things which an independent Scotland will want out of the EU will be things which the rest of the UK will wish to agree to. One of the examples in the White Paper is that Scotland is going to get a share to be negotiated of the UK rebate. Now, if we just think, contrary to what it says in the White Paper, of an agreement, let's suppose we can come to one, an agreement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government before March 2016, that Scotland is going to get a 10% share of the EU rebate. As a matter of EU law, a matter of EU practice, a matter of EU treaties, an independent Scotland has to go to the 28 member states of the EU and say, please, can we have, we think we're entitled to, a rebate equivalent to 10% of that enjoyed by the United Kingdom prior to independence. Now, at that stage, I don't know what the figures are, I've seen one that suggests it's the rebate, or 10% of the rebate might be £500 million or 500 million euros a year. What we're effectively saying to the other member states, including the UK, is please give us a rebate of £500 million and the rest of you will have to make that up. Under what circumstances could a United Kingdom government, acting in the interests of the rest of the United Kingdom, agree to accept that sort of obligation? And if you try and bring that negotiation to the point before independence, how could a United Kingdom government put a proposal to other member states with which it, looking forward to its future responsibilities, it simply could not agree to? It's the sort of impracticality. Legally speaking, I don't see, or from a matter of common sense point of view, I don't see how any UK government could advance a position on the rebate, to take that as the example, prior to formal independence, which would deal with Scotland's interests and its own post-independence interests. I just don't see how any person could do that, representing two points of view which are diametrically opposed.
I would actually agree with Patrick Layden on the point that the UK government not only has to continue to represent Scotland, but also the rest of the United Kingdom. So it's not a question of it acting in bad faith if it doesn't put everything which the Scottish government would like it to do so. For example, one of the things which is being suggested in the White Paper is that Scotland should be able, post-independence, to charge university fees for people who are living in the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, that would be post-independence and post-continued membership of the European Union, direct discrimination on grounds of nationality, which is prohibited as a fundamental principle of EU law. It would only be a possibility if there was specific treaty amendment to allow Scottish universities to discriminate on grounds of nationality against the rest of the UK as opposed to other EU nationals. And without that, they would be very hard-pressed to maintain the policy, which the Scottish Government says it will do, of charging the English university fees, but not home students and not the rest of the European Union. How can one expect the United Kingdom government in any pre-negotiations to say, we would like you, on behalf of Scotland, to allow a treaty amendment which will allow effectively a discrimination against all the other people we happen to represent in the rest of the United Kingdom? That is not going to happen. So there are tensions, clearly, in the RU, in any suggestion of going down Article 48, because there are competing interests of potentially two different member states.
I do actually appreciate your position on that one. We're trying to focus on the elements of the white paper that have bearing on this committee. So if you don't mind, we would rather stick to the criteria that's set for this inquiry at this point in time. Yeah, I've got Claire Adamson and Neil Bibby. Do you want a quick supplementary? Yeah, okay. Claire,
thanks very much.
Can you answer?
Yeah, obviously, sorry. Okay, yeah. Sorry. I have a whole load of issues that I would like to ask about, but I'm going to be restricted, I guess, by time this morning. But I'm intrigued by the statement I think Mr. Layden made about the ordinary course of European law, because there doesn't seem to be anything ordinary about the situation at all. It seems to be an exceptional situation, one that wasn't envisaged in the treaties. And is it not more likely that, given the Edinburgh Agreement, and I would like to hear your opinion on the portions of the Edinburgh Agreement in terms of negotiation, but is it not the case that it's much more likely to be a political solution that would be found on a yes vote, rather, and the legal route would be, it would be the political will that would take precedent in what would happen?
I agree with you. As I said in my written evidence, if everybody agreed, if the United Kingdom government and the Scottish government were to reach agreement as to the terms upon which independence would be achieved, and if, following that, all the member states, all the other member states and the European institutions agreed that Scotland should become a member state on the terms proposed in the White Paper, then, and they were prepared to ratify such an agreement within the 18 months between the vote and Scottish formal independence, then I don't think that the detailed question of treaty base matters. If everybody agrees, then they make a new treaty, they tip their hats in the drafting of it to Article 48 or 49 or Article 2 and Article 4 or any of the fluffy things which the front of the treaty has in it, and they do what they want to do politically. And so I agree with you entirely. But before you get to that point, you have to assume that all the things in the White Paper are going to turn out the way that the Scottish Government wants them to, and that all the things that they want out of this continuity arrangement with Europe are going to be acceptable to all the other member states. And if you assume all those things, then yes, the political will overcome the detail in the treaty. The difficulties arise when you begin to wonder what will happen if everybody else doesn't agree with our position. And so I entirely accept your premise that it would be possible for a political decision to overrule all these quibbles about treaty base. But you have to start from the premise that everyone's going to agree with everything we want.
Could I just, for the sake of legal clarity, the number of things in the treaties which you have to amend is relatively small. A lot of the discussion that we've been having is about things which do not themselves necessarily require treaty amendment. If you look at the accession of Croatia, the accession treaty is enormous, but the actual amendments to the treaties required by the accession of Croatia, and that's the treaty articles, is very small, relatively speaking. It's important to bear in mind the distinction between that which must be negotiated in terms of amendment of the treaties, simply to provide for Scotland as a state separate from rest of UK, and all the other attendant matters which would have to be negotiated, but which do not necessarily require treaty amendment.
Yeah, supplementaries. I was also intrigued about just the timescale and some of the assertions about how difficult negotiation would be, and yet the UK government position at the moment seems to be that they can successfully renegotiate their terms of the treaty and hold a referendum by 2017. Those timescales don't seem particularly different, and I think the negotiation for Scottish independence would be in some ways far less complex, because what we want is a status quo rather than a change to any of the existing arrangements for the UK.
But, you know, two implausible timescales does not one plausible timescale make. So, I mean, I don't think that quite cuts it. I mean, I think the question you raised earlier is important, because we're in unknown legal territory. It's a question about what seems more legally plausible rather than implausible, and that's the kind of terrain we're in. And when it comes to the negotiation timescale, then again we're back to the issue of, well, what looks more or less plausible. It's not wholly implausible that the timescale set in the white paper could be met, but you've got to then be realistic about what the potential obstacles are. And I think one of the disappointments in the white paper is it doesn't just candidly canvass what might be obstacles along the way, and what would happen if the timescale isn't met. It's simply a large aspiration that the timescale can be met in a timescale set itself by the Scottish Government. I mean, I don't think I can recall any accession process by which the entity seeking to become a member state set the timescale itself or determined the date upon which its membership would occur. That seems unusual. And also, just in terms of negotiating strategy, Aidan O'Neill talked about the things that would have to be negotiated. Well, one of the difficulties of setting yourself a very specific date for which you wish to acquire both independence and Scottish membership is then you're then under a great deal of pressure to make sure those negotiations fit that timescale. And the issue for the Scottish electorate then is, well, what concessions will have to be made along the way to meet that timescale? So there's great risks in the timescale in terms of its achievability, but also what it may result in terms of concessions along the way.
I know that we're trying to look at the legal issues today, but we keep straying on to the politics of how that might happen. And I would like to ask a little bit about the EU nationals who live in Scotland at the moment. I think, Mr O'Neill, you mentioned democratic deficit of very early on, but we're having European elections very shortly. There are EU nationals here in Scotland who will vote for a representative for them to represent them in the European Parliament as MEPs. If we do vote for independence and we go forward, and the citizenship of Scottish national change, does the nationality of EU members here remain with their member state, or what happens to them? Do they go into some sort of limbo in terms of the relationship with Europe at that time?
It's a very, very interesting question. If one were to posit the possible, I was going to say nightmare scenario of Scotland being independent but outside the European Union, and, as Patrick Layden has suggested, British nationality no longer being afforded to Scottish citizens, then then European Union nationals who are here are no longer within the EU and have no longer claims against the independent Scotland for the protection of their EU rights. But more importantly, and perhaps more stunningly, is that Scottish nationals, and we're told that Scottish-born non-residents will automatically be given Scottish citizenship, who are working elsewhere in the EU, and that would by then include presumably working in London, they would lose all their rights as EU citizens and would become extra-communitarians who would be in the same category as Americans, Russians or Australians, as opposed to the privileged category of Romanian, Bulgarians and even Turks, because Turkey has an association agreement with the EC. So, as I say, it's something one doesn't really particularly want to contemplate, but yes, it would mean a massive change in the rights of EU citizens living in Scotland, but perhaps more importantly, Scottish citizens living in the rest of the UK and in the rest of the EU. So,
given the implications of effectively a hole in the EU, as we would see it in that sort of, you described it as a nightmare scenario, I think that's quite an apt description of it, but given what was said about stability earlier on, is it not your opinion that that would be a situation that would be not only not in Scotland's interest, but not in the interests of other EU member states at all?
Absolutely, and I agree with what Sir David was saying about this. The court is very keen on the idea of once people acquire rights, and they acquire rights independently of the member states, they acquire it as a matter of their relationship with EU law, that is not a scenario which the Court of Justice would particularly wish, and it may even be, even if some member states think it's actually not a bad thing to cause this kind of chaos or difficulties. But one of the very interesting issues is that because we have this notion of EU citizenship, that actually affects the modes of how member states can withdraw their own citizenship from their existing citizens, precisely because withdrawal of citizenship of say, UK British nationality will have an effect on, will cause a loss of EU nationality. Then the Court of Justice says that's got to be subject to review by the courts and is subject to a whole proportionality analysis and test. There's a case called Rotman against Bavaria, which looks into that. So, from a classic public international law, one thinks that who gets citizenship or who doesn't get citizenship is a matter wholly and purely for an individual member state. But once it's a member state within the European Union, precisely because of the effects that has on individuals and their European rights, that becomes a matter which is a matter for the courts and ultimately for the Court of Justice.
I don't understand the implications of that argument, because it seems to say that because we're citizens of the EU now, even after formal independence, then we still remain citizens of the EU. Now that might, as you say, leave a hole in the EU, but we will have dug the hole. It's not something we're going to fall into by accident. It's a decision we take. If we take the decision to come out of the UK, then unless some exceptional political will is evidenced between the vote and formal independence, on formal independence, our citizens will not be citizens of the EU. I myself am not particularly impressed by the sort of chaos of the relationships and citizens walking along the road suddenly finding themselves bereft of the right to walk along the road. There are lots of countries in Europe which aren't in the EU and where EU citizens go and move quite freely. So if you were visiting Norway, you'd be going outside the EU, but that wouldn't actually affect your ability to walk around the place and buy things in the shops and so on. It would affect your ability to vote in elections. Norwegian citizens here can't vote in EU elections, but that is something which could be sorted out, if we wanted to sort it out, and we probably would, by some sort of an agreement with the EU as an institution. We could agree, as a matter of international law, between an independent Scotland and the EU that for a period, whatever period we thought it was going to take to achieve formal membership, that nationals of Scotland would have such and such rights in the EU and nationals of the EU would have such and such rights in Scotland. It wouldn't affect contractual arrangements, and we could suspend or arrive at an interim solution so that Sir David Edward could still get delivery of his car without paying large amounts of excise duty on it. That would be the way I would approach it.
Could I ask Patrick Layden what article of the treaty permits you to give temporary concessions to citizens of countries outside the EU?
I think that if the European Union were minded to have a treaty with an independent Scotland, just as it is minded to have a treaty with an independent Norway, it could do so. I don't see that such a treaty including voting rights, but I don't think the right to vote in local and European elections is the most important part of our ability to move around the rest of Europe. Otherwise, I don't see why the excise matters, the matters which actually affect the goods and things, the fishing rights, for instance, other countries which have rights over fishing make arrangements with the EU so that EU fishing boats can go and use those waters. Norway does, Iceland does, we could, pending a formal negotiation by which Scotland would become part of the EU. And if I were in that position between the vote for independence and formal independence, that's where I would be putting my energy, to making sure that the existing arrangements, so far as they were important to us, would continue. And I don't see any particular technical difficulty about that.
Okay, I'm going very conscious that colleagues aren't getting in as much questions as they would, although your evidence is very, very interesting. Neil Bibby and then Willie Coffey.
As has been said, the White Paper says transition to Scotland's membership of the EU would be secured under Article 48. We've heard this morning that that is not plausible. As Jamie McGregor has said, President Barroso of the EU Commission has indicated that Article 49 would be the route. President Van Rompuy of the European Council has said if a part of the territory of a member state ceases to be part of that state because that territory becomes a new independent state, the treaties will no longer apply to that territory. The Spanish Prime Minister has said, I know for sure, that a region that would separate from a member state of the European Union would remain outside the European Union, and that should be known by Scots and the rest of European citizens. And the Croatian Prime Minister has said about Croatia strictly adheres to the position that all prospective EU members have to undergo a thorough, strict and fair negotiation process, fully adapting to the body of legislation, the rules and procedures of the EU. There can be no shortcuts. Different things, of course, could happen, but given what is being said in the EU, it looks highly likely to me that Article 19 would need to be the route, 49 would need to be the route, and not 48, as has been said in the White Paper. Given what is being said in the EU, what would make Scotland's entry to the EU go down an Article 48 route? Would anyone suggest that if President Barroso, President Van Rompuy, the Spanish Prime Minister and any other Prime Ministers want it to be done on Article 49, that A, it can't happen, and B, it won't happen?
Just say this. I was a judge of the European Court for 14 years. I remember repeated occasions on which politicians have asserted particular positions which the court has found to be wrong.
There's obviously two sets of politicians asserting two different things, so that could apply to the Scottish Government.
Of course, yes, I'm not suggesting that. My position has always been very, very limited, that there is a gap between the vote and the moment of independence. And in that period, you have an obligation to negotiate a solution to the problem. And that is ignored by Barroso, Van Rompuy, and all those who talk about it. But, I mean, my belief is that you could mount a case before the European Court. Whether you'd get an answer within the 18 months is an entirely separate question. But please, am I going to lose my rights at the moment of independence? I don't know what the answer would be, but I'd be prepared to bet that it wouldn't be the Van Rompuy answer.
I think it's very easy for us, and especially if you put a bunch of lawyers in a room, you'll get, well, there's 4 of us, so you'll probably get at least 8 opinions on what might happen. It's very easy to get caught up, though, on the 49, which is at which way. I mean, for the reasons I've given earlier, I think I'm clear that I think 49 is the right route. But whichever route you go down, whether it's a treaty amendment or an accession process, certainly the same legal requirements arise. That is the unanimous consent of the existing member states, and that whatever is agreed is then ratified in the member states, both of which create risks. The first risk is, of course, that one or more member states decide that they will exercise a right of veto. And whatever we may say about the rights of individuals and citizens and all the rest of it, those are important claims. They give rise to, I think, as Sir David Edward has articulated very clearly, obligations to negotiate in good faith, none of which can deviate from the hard legal truth of the treaty, which is any state can veto the process. And let's not forget that France held the UK out of the EEC through the 1960s. When the UK sought to join in 63 and 67, de Gaulle said no. So we shouldn't be surprised if at some point another member state, and it may well be Spain, decides that it will either exercise a veto or will at least threaten to exercise the veto. The second risk is, of course, ratification. Now, we ought to at least assume that ratification should occur without too much difficulty. But again, if you go down the Article 48 route of a treaty revision, and if that treaty revision deals with more than Scottish membership of the EU, deals with other issues, as soon as they start dealing with other issues, you then create potential ratification problems in member states if, for whatever reason, they don't like what the treaty revision is being proposed. Now, the timescale for ratification is itself something which needs to be factored into the timescale. And there is a real difference between what the White Paper says and the supplementary paper on Scotland in the EU. The White Paper talks about the negotiations and all other processes being completed within 18 months. The supplementary document only refers to negotiations being completed within 18 months. If you then have to have ratification on top of that, that can then delay the process for 6 months or another 18 months on top of that. So again, some form of legal hiatus is a risk.
Coffee.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think I would like Kenneth Armstrong on my side when we were doing risk assessments and so on to pinpoint the potential negatives and pitfalls that might arise. Sometimes I think we forget, Convener, that a democratically expressed vote by a nation-state for its independence should give rise to such a negative and hostile reaction against Scotland within Europe. I don't see that one would cause the other. I think it's clear from what we've heard this morning that 3 of our guests favour the 49 route and 1 of our guests favours the 48 route. I would like to ask our 3 guests who favour the 49 route to explain to me the legal basis on which Scotland would find itself outside the European Union. Could you explain that to me, whether it's your opinion or whether there is a legal basis to cast Scotland out of the European Union? And I would like to ask Sir David, who expressed the alternative view that 48 could be deployed, for his view on what you say. Well, I suppose 49, just from its terms, says any European state which respects the values of Article 2 may apply to be a member of the Union. Scotland would be a European state which reflected the values of Article 2, so it would seem to fall squarely within the terms of it. It certainly isn't a European state at the moment because it is part of the United Kingdom. So it's something new is going to be created upon independence. I think we're all agreed upon that. And so if something new is created upon independence, if we have a new member state, then we have, as Sir David says, the requirement of at least some amendment of the treaties to allow for representation in the Council, members of Parliament, members of the European Parliament, the voting weight which is to be accorded to that independent member. So clearly change has to happen in the treaties, and as Professor Armstrong has said, that requires unanimity of all the existing member states. Now, those are simple legal facts. Whether they're politically welcome or not is not really for me to judge or give any view on.
Is that a component part or mechanism of any of the treaties that Scotland shall be expelled at some particular point in this journey? Is there anything in any of the treaties that say that explicitly?
It's not a question of Scotland being expelled. Scotland is part of the European Union as part of a member state. The question is, how will Scotland become an independent member state in its own right? That's a different matter.
I'm talking about the presumption that 49 can only be deployed for a member state that's outside trying to get in. At what point does Scotland become outside, and what mechanism within any of the treaties gives rise to that?
I don't think the wording of Article 49 simply says any European state which reflects the values. Now, the question is what is meant by European state. I mean, as I think is one of the tensions which is clear from the evidence that we've got thus far, is that in normal international organisations, politics trumps law. In the European Union, law trumps politics, and the ultimate arbiter of what is meant by European state for the purposes of Article 49 would be the Court of Justice. But it would be stretching things a bit. I don't think it would be particularly have been envisaged before that Scotland, in nuce, as it were, in embryo, while still part formally of the United Kingdom, is a European state for the purposes of Article 49. But I agree with what Professor Armstrong said about Durkan and Patrick Layden, is that there can be, one can understand there could well be pre-negotiations with a view to trying to ensure that on independence there will not be this nightmare scenario which I had outlined before of Scotland no longer being represented in the EU, but it's those, insofar as they retain British citizenship, still retaining European citizenship. Now, Patrick Layden said he doesn't understand that. I'm not quite sure why, because the decision to withdraw British citizenship has to be a separate decision by the rest of the UK government. It doesn't follow automatically that simply because a territory is no longer part of the UK that the people in it are no longer British citizens. I mean, there's some parallels with what happened in Ireland with the creation of the Free State there. British citizenship, as you know, is a strangely organic thing which has developed over time. It used to be that anybody in the Empire was entitled to a British passport. We didn't really have a notion of citizenship at all. It was being a subject of Her Majesty, you know, the Queen Empress or whatever, from Victorian times onwards. The idea of British citizenship has evolved over time in association with European citizenship, but now the two are interlinked and intertwined, and one cannot make the classic public international law assumption that because a territory is no longer part of a particular state, that the citizens will and can automatically be deprived of the previous citizenship. So.
Could I just ask you again, gents, to clarify what mechanism in the treaties would see Scotland pushed out of the European Union?
Scotland is not a member state of the European Union. Scotland is a constituent part of the United Kingdom, which is a member state of the European Union. So therefore, the premise of your question is just simply wrong. I mean, it's not a question of Scotland as a member state being expelled, then Scotland as a member state seeking to rejoin. At the moment at which Scotland becomes independent from the United Kingdom, which is the member state, then the treaties cease to apply to Scotland.
The point which Aidan O'Neill makes is that citizen doesn't stop because we might still be British citizens. The arrangements between an independent Scotland, or a soon-to-be independent Scotland, and the rest of the United Kingdom about free movement of the people north and south of the border are a matter for us. We can decide, and I hope that we would, as the UK did with the Irish in the 1920s, that people can move freely back and forward and might have voting rights and so on. The test for European citizenship is that you're a national of a member state. Every national of a member state shall be a citizen of the Union. if, following independence, we say that our nationals are still nationals of a member state, the United Kingdom, and therefore citizens of the European Union, I don't see what we're gaining from independence, because the only member state in the European Union at present is the United Kingdom, which represents, as Sir David has said, the whole of the United Kingdom. The whole point about independence, as I understand it, is that we are able to represent our own interests in the European Union and not have our interests submerged in those of the wider UK. And I understand that perfectly. But the process of becoming independent of the United Kingdom logically entails becoming outside the European Union, because the only way we're in the European Union is as part of the UK. If we come out of the UK, we come out of the European Union. One follows the other, and we can decide, obviously, to do it or not to do it. But if we do it, then the consequence of not being part of the UK is that we're not part of the European Union.
Entails, what's the legal basis for that?
Well, the legal basis is that the state, the new state, which is going to be called Scotland, is not a member state of the European Union. If you look down the list of states set out in the treaty, Scotland doesn't appear there. There's no Scottish judge appointed as such to the European Court of Justice. There's no Scottish commissioner. There is no Scottish seat at the Council in Europe. There are Scottish MEPs, or there are MEPs from Scotland in the European Parliament, but they are not there as Scottish MEPs, they are there as UK MEPs. And if we became outside the European Union, these are things that would have to be sorted. They are minor amendments to the treaty. And I'm assuming, just leaving aside all the opt-outs and things, they are minor amendments to the treaty, but they have to be made. And any treaty amendment requires unanimity. But the sort of legal point is that the whole essence, the whole aspiration of the White Paper is to take Scotland out of the UK and enable it to join, to become a member of the European Union as a separate independent state. And the process of leaving the UK necessarily involves coming out of the European Union. Because if it didn't, you'd have to ask yourself, supposing you argued, as Aidan O'Neill was, that citizenship continues, you'd have to say, on what basis is Scotland part of the EU? We know that Scottish citizens are citizens of the EU because these are inalienable rights and we can't get out of them. But how do we then move directly to the treaty amendments? What duty is there on the other member states to agree the treaty amendments which are necessary to get us into the Council and the Court? There's a kind of legal gap, a sort of logical and gap between saying that our citizens are part of the EU and therefore Scotland's part of the EU, to actually sorting out the practical arrangements by which you make it work. Even assuming, as I say, that there's no dispute about the terms upon which we are members of the EU. And there will be lots of disputes about the terms on which we are members of the EU, because what we want is what the UK currently has, and other member states are unlikely to accept all of that.
Just to be clear, I'm sorry, I didn't, and I've never argued that continuing citizenship, European citizenship of Scottish nationals would mean that therefore Scotland is a member of the EU. What I'd say is that it's an unstable situation to have a large group of European citizens outside the EU, and that would be a political reality which would encourage the idea that there should be treaty amendments by unanimity, that Scotland, with its 5 million EU citizens outside the EU, should actually have to take some of the responsibilities of EU membership by coming on board and being a full independent member of the EU. But it is that citizenship issue is a separate issue, and it's an important weighing factor which will affect the legal and the political realities.
So David Edwards could have views of all of that, please.
I would just explain I have to explain more clearly my thinking about Article 48. I envisage that it would be necessary to have a treaty agreed, and certainly with ratification, unanimity and ratification, which might or might not be possible within the period of 18 months envisaged in the White Paper. But what might the treaty say? The treaty might say, for example, considering that it is agreed that Scotland and rest of UK shall be separate states as from a date to be determined. Therefore, Article 1, as from that date, Article 52 of the Treaty on European Union shall be amended to the following effect: the treaty shall apply to the Kingdom of Belgium, to the Kingdom of Scotland, and to the United Kingdom of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. That is the treaty amendment which I would envisage, which you could agree long before the moment of independence, which would take effect at the moment of independence. Now, that's entirely a different question from the 101,001 other things you'd have to negotiate and the perils you incur on the way there because of difficulty with other member states. But if we're talking simply about the law, then it is perfectly possible to have a treaty agreed, a treaty amendment agreed, which takes effect at a moment in the future.
Finishing that off, I mean, the three gentlemen that favour the 49 route, are you saying that it's impossible legally to use 48 as expressed by Sir David Ed?
I don't say it's impossible. I say that if everybody agrees, as I said earlier, if everybody agrees with the result that we want to get to, then the question of treaty base becomes of little importance. Your problem is if you try and use an existing treaty base which isn't the appropriate one, then not only do you have the very serious practical and political problems that Professor Armstrong has mentioned, but you're liable to challenge in the European Court of Justice, as Monsieur Piri said in his written evidence. They like to have things done in accordance with the appropriate treaty base. And the very fact of having a challenge in the Court of Justice of the European Union would effectively knock out your timetable, because the timetable only works if everybody agrees. There's lots of things to be decided in this 18 months. There's a serious deal to be done between Scotland and the rest of the UK internally. It's going to be a lot of work, and I think it's pretty optimistic to think that you could do it in 18 months. If you add on to that a negotiation with Europe, then I think it's extremely optimistic to think you can do that within 18 months. And if you try and include every nation's ratification process, then I think it becomes hopelessly optimistic. But you could, if you could do all those things, then it would work. The risk is that if we tried, or if the UK tried, to use an existing treaty base like Article 48 in circumstances where there wasn't a complete unanimity, then we're met with an objection by another member state, we're met by an objection from the European Parliament, which has rights under Article 49, and that would effectively block the process.
Can I just pick up a point that you made there about timescale? And there'll be lots of discussion about timescale, legally, politically, the whole lot. But last week we took evidence from two members of EFTA who gave us an insight into the situation that they arrived at with Austria, Sweden and Finland. And given the evidence that Sir David Edward has provided us with on the articles that would need to be agreed, so 35, whatever articles, and whether we meet them, I mean, I think some of us would contest, and probably all of us would contest, that to be compliant with EU law and EU institution procedure and process, then we already probably comply with all of those articles pending negotiation on some of the opt-outs. So given that we're at that position, Austria, Sweden and Finland, EFTA said to us last week that they were probably about 70% there when it came to agreeing and meeting all the conditions of the articles, but it only took them 13 months to negotiate the whole timescale. So, you know, it would not, I think, be unrealistic for a timescale as suggested to meet that, given, you know, the precedent that's already been set by Austria, Sweden and Finland.
I agree that technically Scotland already complies with its European obligations, and that on the technical aspects of whether or not we could implement EU legislation, we would have little trouble in persuading people that we were perfectly well able to do that. There are two other aspects, however. One is that the European institutions expect to deal with independent authorities in member states on matters such as finance. They expect to find in every member state a central bank with whom their bankers can talk. They expect to find independent authorities on a range of national institutional matters, so that they have a contact point, if you like, a responsible contact point in each member state. One of the questions that we're going to have with the UK government following a yes vote is how Scotland sets those up in Scotland, or in the case of the Bank of England, whether or not we can carry on in a sterling area with the Bank of England as the lender of last resort and our central bank. I don't know, sitting here, whether, if we did manage to secure that agreement with the UK government, whether the European Union would accept that as a sufficient discharge of our duty to have an independent financial authority in Scotland. I do know that you couldn't open the negotiation with Europe on that matter until you'd secured an agreement, or secured, if you like, a disagreement with the United Kingdom government. And so part of your 18 months is going to be spent trying to persuade the UK government, or reaching agreement with the UK government on that matter and the terms on which it was going to operate. And even assuming that that was going to be agreed, there would be a period of negotiation while you arrived at that solution. Then you could go to Europe and say, look, we have a central bank, it's the Bank of England, and that's how things are going to work. Would you please agree to that being our independent financial authority? But one has to happen before the other one can take place. And that's why I think that, I mean, leaving aside all the other things we're going to have to negotiate with the UK government before independence, that's why I think that the timetable of settling with Europe at the same time as settling with the UK is impractical. That, if you look at it in a critical path analysis terms, there are various things that we could talk to Europe about while we were negotiating with the UK government. There are various things that we can't talk to Europe sensibly about until we've finished negotiating those particular matters with the UK government. And that's why I think that the timetable is challenging.
Yes, there's some that would say the impracticality is the UK's insistence that it won't negotiate on some of these matters that could be negotiated before the referendum.
You may well be right, but that, at present, at any rate, seems to be a political fact. And applying such legal judgment as I have to the facts, if the negotiations on either basis, either with Europe or with the UK government, can't start until after a yes vote, then the position is, I think, as I've set it out, that there are some things that would have to wait until we've got agreement with the UK government. I entirely agree with you. If we could get agreement with them in principle now, then that would make things much easier.
Okay, I'm going to move on, and I think some of the questions that I think that Rod Campbell's coming in with will maybe give you the opportunity.
It was just that you gave the example of that accession. I think it is a very useful example, but there are 4 points of differentiation. One is it was an enlargement from an EU of 12 to 15, and therefore the ratification process, which took another 6 months, was relatively quick, but we might expect that to be longer in an enlargement of an EU from 28 to 29. Secondly, for the reasons that Patrick gave, you're talking about conducting parallel negotiations at EU level and domestically in unpicking the union, and therefore that will be challenging for the negotiators. Thirdly, that Austria, Sweden, Finland were independent states exercising powers already as EFTA states. And fourthly, Scotland isn't exercising the same competencies under devolution as it would be exercising were it to become independent, and therefore EU member states will need to be satisfied that in areas that Patrick highlights of foreign policy, economic policy, that they would know exactly how an independent Scotland would institutionally and politically manage those. And that's why the accession procedure under Article 49 is there to verify how an independent state would exercise its responsibilities under the treaties. So the analogy is a good one, but there are 4 clear points of differentiation.
Okay, thanks for that. Rod Campbell.
Thank you for being in there. I refer to my register of interest as a member of the Faculty of Advocates. Sir David, in particular, I'd like to just follow through the question of continued membership of the EU and whether a reference could be made to the European Court of Justice after a yes vote in the referendum as to the pros and cons, given some of the matters we've discussed this morning, of an early reference to the Court of Justice.
Well, my view is that if you look at precedent, there are examples of cases being brought before the Court of Justice on the basis of an action in a national court for a declaratory judgment. So there have been cases where particularly affected businesses have sought a declaration, or what we call in Scotland a declarator, that certain results might follow which would be illegal if something is done. I don't exclude the possibility that you could seek a declarator that, for example, asserts that as from the moment of independence, I, a Scot living in Scotland, currently a national of the United Kingdom, asserting that I claim the right to continued citizenship of the Union as from the moment of independence. Or if you're a business, that my right to import goods free of customs duties from other member states should continue. And in that event, I envisage that a national court might make a reference to the European Court in Luxembourg. There is provision in the procedure for references for accelerated procedure, and therefore I think it is possible, but it's not certain, that you could get a judgment on that issue from the European Court relatively quickly. But it's another problem in the timescale which has been discussed. But I'm not discussing timescales. I'm discussing what is legally possible. So that, I don't know whether that's answered your question.
And I'm just wondering what impact that might have on any kind of political discussions going on at the same time. Could that assist in kind of concentrating the political minds?
Well, I think political minds would be concentrated in a number of ways, because assuming that the court, a reference was made and the reference was accepted by the court in Luxembourg, you then have a situation in which the institutions and the member states could be represented in the discussion about that reference. So the United Kingdom, the Kingdom of Spain, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament would have a right to intervene and make their position clear. They would then have to decide what position they were going to take, quite apart from the position that the court would take up at the end. So you have a situation in which the raising of such an action and the acceptance of such a reference could focus minds very effectively as to the position they were going to take. But I don't say I don't say all this could be done in 18 months. That's a totally different question.
Does anybody else on the panel want to comment on that?
I mean, much as I would love to argue such a point, there would be, I think, there are fairly big problems. First of all, a reference is a matter solely for the court, the national court. It's not a matter for the parties saying we want this to go to Europe. The court itself has to be convinced. Scottish courts, but not just Scottish courts, are not keen on anticipating matters, taking what may be a hypothetical question, and are also particularly not keen on highly sensitive political issues. So it would have to be there would have to be a real decision which had absolutely foreseeable impact, which could then be potentially judicially reviewed, and the Scottish courts, presume it was taken as Scotland, persuaded that it was necessary to make a reference. Scottish courts haven't been particularly at the forefront of those countries which make references to the Court of Justice. You then have to get over the hurdle of the Court of Justice being persuaded that this is a real question and not some kind of manufactured legal point trying to really make a political point. But certainly it is conceivable that such a challenge could be put forward, but I think there are fairly large hurdles that would have to be got over to ever even get to Luxembourg.
If the wider theme of your question was about what litigation might do in the process, certainly I think if the Article 48 process were to be opened and a treaty amendment to be proposed, that would need to go to the European Council for decision. It will be a decision taken by a simple majority. So if the UK in good faith wants to open that negotiation, the European Council would have to make that decision. At that point, it's not inconceivable that another member state might want to challenge the issue of the legal basis of the use of Article 48 as the means by which Scottish membership would be affected. And that's one way to avoid the hypothetical issue that Aidan O'Neill mentions, and that would bring the case directly to the court rather than indirectly through the national courts. And it may well be that if we go back to the example of Spain, if Spain feels that it's in its national interest to query the use of Article 48 as the legal basis, it would well be within its power to bring that legal challenge to the European Council decision opening the treaty revision process.
Ask Mr. Layden, from the evidence you gave for the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Select Committee on Scottish Affairs in May 2012, you have moved some distance. Could you perhaps just clarify for this committee why you've now taken a different view than you did then?
On the question of whether or not you'd have one successor state or two. Yes, well, I've looked further into the matter, and as I say in my note, national practice and political acceptance of a situation has a great deal to do with the effect in international law. If Scotland becomes independent of the United Kingdom, it is possible, as Sir David has said, to say that there are two successor states. And if there are two successor states, then we're both out of the European Union and we both have to apply to go in. Now, I think Sir David says it's a tenable view, and I agree with that, but it's not the view which seems to be being taken by either the UK itself or by other member states or by the European institutions. Because if you accept that view, you involve not just the European Union, but lots of other international organisations in the same sort of difficulty over who is the successor state. As a matter of realpolitik, when the Soviet Union broke up, the Russian Federation said, we are the successor, we are the continuing state. And people like the United Nations Security Council and other international organisations were happy to do that. It gives you stability, it gives you predictability, it enables business to carry on. In the same way, both as a matter of domestic law and as a matter of EU law, and I suspect as a matter of international law, if the separation of Scotland from the United Kingdom is portrayed in United Kingdom legislative terms as Scotland being made independent, but the United Kingdom continuing, which is what happened with Ireland, I suspect that other European states and other international organisations will accept that. And so I've, as you say, I've moved on, and I now think that as a political oblique legal fact, the position will be that the UK will remain a member state and Scotland will be outside the Union.
So David's kind of comments on that.
Well, My view is this discussion about what happens in other international treaties is entirely by the way in the discussion of the EU position. It may perfectly well be the case that the United Nations would accept rest of UK, whatever that may mean, because as I pointed out, it could be said that there will no longer be a Great Britain, of which it can be the United Kingdom. But be that as it may, let's assume. My position is and always has been that you don't get there. You are in an existing situation where a vast number of reciprocal rights and obligations have been created, where there are acquired rights, and where you have an obligation to avoid the disruption of those rights. And therefore, as I pointed out, it would be possible to achieve a situation in which you don't arrive at the discussion in the EU context of successor state and new state.
Malik.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your deliberations so far. I was interested in both aspects in terms of which is the best route to go down. But one of the things that I have taken on board, and I would like to in fact go on to say that I accept that the mission of accomplishing membership in 18 months is, I think, a very large ask, and I'm realistic enough to realize that that probably won't happen. However, as a British subject today, and whether Scotland becomes independent or not, I still retain that nationality, that British nationality. Companies operating out of Scotland today are British companies. They may call themselves Scottish Enterprise or whatever, but they are British. In the gap between not becoming a member and becoming a member, would it not be possible for that trade and that nationality to continue till such times as a membership is established? The fact that, technically speaking, we still are British?
Certainly, you can continue, but as the example I gave about the customs union is not a trivial point. The customs union was the first thing to be established by the EEC, and the essence is that you have a customs frontier. Now, if you have a customs frontier, you have to decide whether goods passing across that frontier are passing within the customs union or into or out of the customs union. And that is that's not a matter of choice. And for myself, it is perfect. Of course you can get interim solutions. Of course you can, but you've got to have a treaty method of getting those interim solutions. It's not, of course you can have an agreement, but there is nothing to have an agreement with until Scotland becomes an entity capable of having an agreement with. So it's always a catch-2 situation.
It's relation to that interim period that I'm speaking of, because if there was a yes vote, and there will be an interim period, however, that said, because the UK government and the European Union government both are refusing to actually enter into discussions, so whether we like it or not, there will be a period of time where there will be insecurity in terms of how do we deal with those issues. And this is why I toyed with the idea that if our companies, which are currently British, and we are obviously British as well, will we actually be able to use that tool to continue that trade legally or not?
Until the moment of separation, nothing has changed. You don't need to make special arrangements because the arrangements are already there. It's only on the assumption that a separation occurs that the problem arises.
Yeah. Mm.
If I may, I think one does have to make a distinction between European citizenship for natural persons, real people, as opposed to the European trading rights that legal persons, companies, might have. And I think, for the reasons I've already outlined today, that I think that the continuing notion of individuals having citizenship is something which potentially might be relied upon in any period of hiatus or interim basis. But I think specific treaty measures would have to be made on an interim basis in terms of continuing trading by legal companies, despite the fact that they are currently based in Scotland, registered in Scotland. If Scotland is independent and isn't then at that point part of the EU, then, as Sir David says, one will have to set up customs barriers and the like, precisely because the EU is a customs union, and anything outside it is outside it, and you have restrictions on free movement of goods and services and the like. So some kind of decision has to be made either way. One either has an agreement to keep things as they are in the interim, or else you actively take steps to set up customs posts to maintain the integrity of the EU at Berwick upon Tweed and down to Carlisle.
But surely that puts us in a position of grave danger in losing our industry if we can't come up with a solution. And is there anything in law to protect us from that?
No, it's the rest of the UK would have an obligation under EU law to maintain the integrity of the customs union. So it would have to be. It's not a matter for Scotland to do anything about it.
That's only up until the independence date. If and when that arrives, that's when there potentially could be a problem for us if we don't have anything in place.
Yep. I mean, there are rules under the World Trade Organization and GATT and things like that, but we'd have to join that as well. So, yeah, there are issues.
I suggested earlier that in the 18-month period between a yes vote and actual independence, supposing it was 18 months, in the period between a yes vote and independence, the Scottish Government could attempt to negotiate an interim treaty with not, as a member of the state of the European Union, but a treaty between soon-to-be independent Scotland and the European Union, which would have the effect, depending on how you negotiated it, of maintaining our customs links, if you like, but not on the basis that we're a member state, on the basis that we're an external state with a particular trade arrangement with the European Union. And that I wouldn't have thought, sitting here now, that would be at all impossible.
But there is no entity called Scotland capable of making such an agreement with the European Union.
Stand presently.
I agree with that. And that would be an area where we weren't talking at that stage about membership of the European Union, but we could have informal negotiations with the EU so that, as at the date when Scotland became independent, as Sir David was saying earlier in relation to possible treaty change, as at the date when Scotland became independent, that international treaty between Scotland and the EU came into effect. And the practical result would be that arrangements like customs unions and companies trading and so on could carry on for that interim period as if Scotland, on the same basis as exists between member states of the EU. I don't see that would be an easy thing to do, but I don't see that it would be technically impossible either.
Just a very, very quick last, and I know we've begged your indulgence for a very long time this morning, but your evidence is very, very interesting to this committee. Very, very quick point on Sir David's evidence, written evidence you gave to the committee. You talk about singing from the same hymn sheet, and you reference that. And you referenced at the bottom, the hymn sheet seems to be an unpublished opinion written some time ago, before the Lisbon Treaty came into force, by a former director of the Legal Service of the Council of Ministers. Now, I'm understanding that as Jean-Claude Pires. Is that correct? Would you agree with his premise that he purports in this evidence that he gave to the committee last week and very disappointingly was used in a very political manner before this committee had actually seen that evidence this week? So just to get a quick insight in where you think his position is and where you disagree.
I've never seen the opinion. I've simply been told that a considerable time ago he gave this opinion, and that was the origin of all the statements that have been made ever since by the leaders of the European institutions, who have a very good political reason for wishing to make that statement. But my disagreement with Jean-Claude Pires and with everybody else who discusses this is because they assume that the moment of the vote is the moment of independence. And they fail to note the difference between voting for independence and actual separation. And so he doesn't engage at all with this problem of, he doesn't engage with the problem of acquired rights at all, and how you resolve that problem. And he simply states that he assumes that the public international law relating to secession applies in this context. And my point simply is that it doesn't, because we're talking in a treaty context, which is totally different.
Okay, on that point, can I thank you very much for all of your evidence this morning. We found it very, very interesting. I've overextended the time. The clerks are worried about timing now for the rest of the committee. But we're going to take a brief recess right now, very quickly, just a quick comfort break, maybe a few minutes, and be back in our seats. But thank you very much for your evidence. Good morning and welcome back to the European and External Relations Committee. I think you'll agree we had a very long but interesting evidence session there. Very quickly moving on to agenda item 3, which is the Brussels Bulletin. You'll have it here. I don't think we've got any points to make on the Brussels Bulletin, so if there's any issues, comments, questions or queries. Jamie?
Yes. I'd like to ask about the agriculture state aid thing. Which I see has increased the what they call de minimis aid, which is the aid that doesn't need to come under state aid rules. It's doubled it, I see, which will be very good news, I think, for sort of crofters and sort of small farmers. But I just wanted to check that do we know in what ways that can be used or not? Or, I mean, I can check that obviously with the NFU.
We can check with Scotland Europa to give us maybe a more detailed analysis.
But it seems,
of that.
I mean, it's good news that it's been doubled. I mean, it'll be good news for a lot of people there.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or queries? Claire?
Just a comment on the Horizon 2020 report, and I think it was interesting that the European Parliament have published the internal report, broadly looking at the research and innovation potential. But I note that in the documents it says that there's a raised awareness among SMEs across Europe about Horizon 2020. I just wondered if it was possible to investigate if there's any Scottish statistics on that and how they conducted that research to get to that point.
Any more? No. Can we take it that we will refer the Brussels Bulletin to the subject committees and committees of interest?
Yes.
Agreed? Thank you very much. We now move on to agenda item 4, which we had agreed to take in private, so we now go into private session. Thank you very much.